So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the March Title I Coordinator webinar. Couple of our usual housekeeping things before we get started. As I just mentioned, please make sure that you've got your camera turned off and your mic muted. This is just to allow all of the participants to focus on the presentation, and it's extra important today since we're only on Teams, nobody's watching through the media portal. As always, we're going to have time at the end for questions, and if you want to come off mute at that time and ask a question, that's fine. You can also submit questions in the Teams chat, or you can send those to me via email. And we are recording this. It will be posted on our Documents and Resources webpage either later today or sometime tomorrow. Oh, and I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Erin Suddeth. I'm the Title I branch manager here at KDE, and I've got two colleagues with me today. I'll let them introduce themselves.
This is David Malonte. I'm one of the assistant directors in the Title I branch.
And Robin, do you want to introduce yourself?
I wasn't sure if I was a colleague or not.
You are a colleague.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Robin Morley. I'm in the Office of Finance and Operations, and I've been working to coordinate all the ESSER activities over the last almost 3 years now. Thanks, Erin.
No problem. Okay, a quick recap from last month's webinar. If you weren't able to join us, that is available on our webpage. Of course, we always have announcements and reminders. We talked about monitoring the obligation of your 310K funds. That's this current year's funds. We shared that the final FY 2024 allocations are now in GMAP. We had our friends from Public Consulting Group join us to talk about the next opt-in period for Title I Next. And we talked about monitoring open projects. So our agenda today, up first, we're going to have Robin share some information about the this liquidation extension. Then we'll get into our usual announcements and reminders, our spend down reminders, the newsletter, and then our two main focuses are going to be evaluating implementation and effectiveness of school-wide program plans and sharing information with principals at Title I schools. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Robin.
All right, thank you. Is it okay, Erin, if I don't come back on camera just so that I can see the screen really well?
That's fine.
Thank you. So you can go ahead to the next slide.
All right.
So just as a reminder, first of all, thank you all for making time for me on the agenda today. I know that a lot of the Title I folks have been involved in the ESSER activities that have been there since 2021, I guess. It seems like a lifetime ago. We now have the first two ESSER programs have completed. They've passed their grant-in period. We've done all of the final payments and liquidations. We've done our final federal cash draws, and ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 are essentially put to bed. The only thing remaining is some annual performance reporting that we have to do for those grants. So we're going to talk today about the ARP ESSER dollars, simply because those dollars are going to close. That grant period closes on September 30, 2024. So with, as was true of ESSER 2, we are, the U.S. Department of Education has offered an ARP liquidation extension application process. I just wanted to bring that to folks' attention this morning. In the event that your district has ARP ESSER activities that will not be completely wrapped up by September 30, we want you to be aware of this liquidation extension period and be able to take advantage of that, apply for that if it would be of benefit to the students and the staff in your district. So just a quick highlight, on May 6th, we are going to open an ARP liquidation extension request on GMAP. It will look very similar to what the ESSER 2 liquidation extension request. There are a few questions that have been added to the application for ARP because the U.S. Department of Ed is asking for some additional information. We're going to close that application period on July 1st. So what that means is that if a district wants to apply for an ARP liquidation extension, the ARP funds must be obligated by July 1st. And then the Department of Education is the one who actually has to submit to the U.S. Department of Education one single consolidated liquidation extension request. We're gonna, our target date is doing that on no later than August 15th. And that is why we need your information submitted by July 1st. We'll be consolidating all of the different districts' applications. KDE will probably be submitting some applications on our behalf. And so we've got to have enough time to get all of that documentation, all of that information in order. If you are not submitting a liquidation extension request, then just a quick reminder, all of your ARP funds must be obligated by September 30, 2024. Next slide, please. Okay, these are things I probably have already said. Just a quick reminder that the ARP funds must be obligated no later than September 30th. Funds which are part of an extended liquidation must be obligated by July 1st. We're going to talk in just a minute about what it means to be obligated, although most of you all are probably already familiar with that with your work through Title I. Without an approved liquidation extension, then all of your payments must be made, your final payments must be made, your reimbursements must be requested from KDE by November 15th. And with this approved liquidation extension, then there are certain payments and reimbursement requests that can be extended for up to 18 months. That's going to be, we haven't set the specific date, but it will be sometime in February 2026. So in essence, your district is getting an additional 18 months to take advantage of and expend those ARP funds beyond the end of the grant period. Next slide, please. Just a highlight of the process we're going to go through. We will collect that extension request in GMAP. It's largely the same as before. Again, I'm talking about things twice now.
I do it all the time.
There is one thing that we haven't talked about, and that is, as a part of the liquidation extension, the U.S. Department of Ed requires KDE to actually collect and maintain extensive documentation about the project, how you're going to spend the money, and then the actual expenditures through that extended liquidation period. I don't know if that's true for other grants that you may have been a part of, but for ARP ESSER, we do have to obtain and maintain extensive documentation from your district, and that is submitted as a part of the application in the GMAP system. One final point that is also a little bit tricky, and it does affect some of the district's decision about whether to request an extension, is that most what I'm calling a change order, a contract amendment, a contract modification, most change orders to these ARP ESSER funded obligations that are signed after September 30th cannot be paid with ESSER funds. Now, that there are some exceptions to that. So if you have questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address will be at the end of the presentation. But change orders can be a little bit tricky, and we don't want anyone to get hung up to request an extension and then find out you're not actually going to be able to use that. Next slide, please. So this is the slide that we use. This is actually from CFR 76.707. This is how the federal government defines when an obligation is made. And you will see like on item A and C, if you're buying something from an outside party, a good, a service, property, the day you sign that contract, and it has to be a binding written commitment, the day you sign that, that is the date the obligation is made. So as long as the contracts are signed on or before September 30th, that would meet the definition of being obligated for ARP purposes. But there are a couple of things that may, that caused KDE to give pause, and that is item B. If an ESSER-funded service is being provided by an employee of the district, then that service is considered obligated when the service is performed. So employees cannot be paid with ARP ESSER funds for work performed on or after October 1st, 2024. So that differs from the contractor, which we talked about just before that. If you have services being provided by a contractor, the day you sign that contract, the obligation is made. If the service is being provided by an employee, the day the employee performs the work is when the obligation is made. The other thing that may be a little bit, it's been a little bit tricky for KDE is item F, travel costs. Travel costs are considered obligated on the date the travel is taken. So if an employee travels on September 30th and it is related to ESSER, then that travel can be paid with ARP ESSER funds. If the employee travels on October 1st, then those travel costs cannot be paid with ARP ESSER funds. And that is true with or without a liquidation extension. Every obligation, the obligation end date in the essence is September 30th. And Aaron, I don't know if that's consistent with what happens in Title I or if this is something new for folks, but I'll be happy to take any questions about that via email, or I'm going to hang on to the end of your meeting just in case folks have questions that arise. Next slide.
That
please.
it is the same as what we have.
The
so
same. Okay,
people should
great.
be familiar with it.
Then they've got that. You all have this down. Just another generic sort of reminder about ARP ESSER funds. If you all are aware of any construction or renovation projects then that are going on in your district that are being paid with ARP ESSER funds, then federal prevailing wage, Davis-Bacon Related Act, that is the federal prevailing wage law applies and compliance is required. Also, if you have any of those construction projects or renovation projects that have not been submitted to KDE for approval, even if you're what they call a House Bill 678 district, those projects need to come to KDE. You do that for ARP ESSER, you do that through the submission of an update or an amendment to your state plan, your district ARP plan. If you have submitted that project in your district ARP plan and it has been approved by KDE, then that sort of checks the box for prior approval. But if you are not familiar with Davis-Bacon Act compliance, again, let me know and I will put you in contact with the right folks who can give you all the information that you might need about that. And I believe that is my last slide. Yes, so if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to Matt Ross. He's the Associate Commissioner of Office of Finance and Operations. I know you all know Thelma, and so if you have questions, you can also always reach out to Thelma Hawkins and then myself as well. So are there some questions or anything?
We did get a question in the chat. Does this
Okay.
include the ARP HCY2?
It does not. This is ARP ESSER only. And I can't speak to the homeless, but I have had that question before and did get that answer. So.
All right. And as of right now, we don't have any other questions.
Great. I'm going to just hang around. So if there are anything else that arises, just sing out.
Absolutely. All right, our announcements and reminders for this month. As I mentioned last month, the competitive FY 2024 McKinney-Vento Homeless Children Education Program grant applications, those are due in April 18th by 4 p.m. Eastern. And you can find additional information on the competitive grants from KDE webpage. You can also contact Zachary Stumbo. He is our homeless education coordinator. The next reminder is that the current Title I Next opt-in period ends tomorrow, March 29th. And I just wanted to briefly give you kind of a timeline for what happens after that period ends. So once it ends, PCG compiles all of the respondents who have said that they want to opt in, and they send that to me and David for review. After we review and approve that, we send it back to them, and then they will reach out with information about training opportunities for those of you who have opted in. And as a reminder, we are going to have more opt-in dates in the future. If you want to opt in now and you haven't done that, you can get a link to the opt-in survey form in the March newsletter. And I also wanted to share this link to a new document from the U.S. Department of Education. Got some new non-regulatory guidance around serving preschool children through Title I Part A. As always, we're just going to take a quick look at our timeline for making sure you meet the requirement to obligate at least 85% of the current year funds by September 30th. So remember, these percentages are just very general guidelines. These aren't required by ESSA. I've just divided 85% by the 15 months you have to do it. So by the end of March, you want to see roughly 51% either spent or encumbered. Now, if you are significantly below that point, just make sure that you are meeting with your finance officer to ensure that you're on track to meet that carryover requirement by September 30th. So for example, we know that salaries cannot be encumbered. So for those of you who are paying for staff, you may be below 51% at this time, but if you sit down with your finance officer and have kind of a projection of the expenses for salary and benefits and things like that between now and September, that'll give you a better idea as to whether or not you're going to need a carryover waiver. It's okay that if you've spent or encumbered more than what's on the table, but again, be sure to take a closer look, take some action if it's significantly less. You might want to increase your monitoring of expenditures, maybe have additional conversations with your finance officers, meet more with your principals regarding their spending, things like that. And of course, Project 310K is not the only Title I project that is currently open. We did review this table of all the open projects during our February webinar. So we've currently got 3 open projects, 310I, J, and K. Remember that KDE received an extension for 310I funds. So I did include the original deadlines on this table, but I put some strike through text just kind of as a reference. So our 2024 deadlines that you need to keep on your radar are June 30th. That is the deadline to have all 310I funds obligated. August 30th is when you can submit the final federal cash request for those 310I funds. Then September 30th, we've got 2 important things on that date. It's the deadline to have all of your 310J funds obligated and the deadline to have at least 85% of your 310K funds obligated. And then finally, November 15th is the deadline to submit the final federal cash request for 310J funds. So again, check with your finance officer to make sure that you're on track to meet these deadlines. And in the coming weeks, you may receive some reminder emails from me just to make sure that you're keeping an eye on these things. Be sure to check out the March newsletter if you haven't done so already. We had information on the open projects and their deadlines, an article about Title I data collection and reporting for the 23-24 school year. We had an announcement about the final FY24 allocations being available in GMAP. We had our Title I Next opt-in period announcement. We had an In Case You Missed It article tied back to an ESEA Now article about meaningful consultation. And of course, we had the coordinator's year at a glance tasks for February. So as we approach the end of the school year, it's good to begin thinking about your program evaluation. Section 1114B3 of ESSA states that schools operating school-wide programs shall develop a comprehensive plan that remains in effect for the duration of the school's participation, except that the plan and its implementation shall be monitored and revised as necessary based on student needs. And this is just to make sure that all of the students are getting those opportunities to meet challenging state academic standards. Now remember that your CSIP serves as your school-wide program plan that's required in that section of ESSA. The evaluation requirements are outlined in the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, or EDGAR, and we have a link to that on this slide. So EDGAR states that a school operating a school-wide program must do the following things: regularly monitor the implementation of and results achieved by the school-wide program, and that's going to be using data from the state's annual assessments and other indicators of academic achievement. So the methods for evaluating the strategies and activities of your school-wide plan are listed there in your CSIP. So some of your data points, such as your KSA data, obviously that data is not available yet, but you probably have some other data points that may help you in your evaluation, such as formative and summative assessments from throughout the school year, stakeholder feedback, etc. You're also required to determine whether the school-wide program has been effective in increasing the achievement of students in meeting those state academic standards, particularly for those students who had been the furthest from achieving the standards. So when you're looking at those different data points, you want to figure out, does it show if you're making progress? Are you moving in the right direction? And then the final requirement is to revise that school-wide plan as necessary based on the results of this regular monitoring. And that is just to ensure continuous improvement of students in the school-wide program. So when you're taking a look at this, doing your evaluation, consider whether or not you need to maybe make some tweaks to the program. Also think about whether or not you were able to implement the program as planned, or if you encountered any obstacles that maybe need to be addressed for next year. Maybe people needed more training on something, for example. So think about what impact the program had on student need over the school year. Now, don't forget to document the evaluation process so that you can help demonstrate your compliance. So can you demonstrate that the appropriate stakeholders were invited to participate in this process? Do you have evidence of data being analyzed? And finally, consider how you've shared this information with the principals, because they're the ones who are going to be leading this charge. And think about how you're supporting them to ensure that these requirements are being met. And that really transitions us into our next topic, which is sharing information with principals. So sometimes when we're on site for a monitoring visit, we can observe a bit of a disconnect between some of the information and program knowledge of the district coordinator and that of the building principals. Principals aren't always aware of the resources that are designed to help them meet compliance requirements. So I really want everyone to remember that disseminating relevant program information and resources to Title I principals is one of your responsibilities as the Title I coordinator. It's important that the staff involved in the Title I program have an understanding of requirements and expectations related to their position. An understanding of requirements helps people see why it's important. So a Title I principal may not need to know something like how to complete the GMAP application, for example, but they do need to understand the rank and serve requirements and how spending in line with that approved budget that was in the GMAP application helps ensure that requirement is met. The Title I program contains both district and school level requirements. The district coordinator is responsible for providing technical assistance and oversight to the schools, and the schools have a responsibility to do their part of the work as well. This is similar to the relationship between KDE and the district. We provide you with information, assistance, and resources for things like the GMAP application, the comparability report, etc. But ultimately, it's up to you, the district, to complete those items. One thing to think about is how you're sharing this information. Up first, we've got meetings. So maybe you have regular meetings with your principals. Now, it's okay if you don't have a meeting that is entirely focused on Title I. A timely Title I talking point can be easily incorporated into an existing meeting. For example, if you've got a beginning of the year principals meeting, that's the perfect time to review requirements about hosting the annual meeting, discussing the compact during an elementary level parent-teacher conference, things like that. Including a brief summary of what was discussed in your meeting minutes would be a good piece of documentation in the event that the district is selected for monitoring. Or maybe you set up specific training sessions before the beginning of the new school year. I have seen some districts devote an entire meeting or a portion of a PD workday to Title I information. Again, this might be a good session to have in a July or early August PD session to really help set the tone for the entire school year, review requirements, expectations, etc. In addition to sharing resources that are created by KDE, some districts do like to create their own district-specific resources for principals. For example, you may want to use something like the Title I Year at a Glance that's in our KDE Title I handbook as a bit of a guide to create something similar for the principals in your district. And then you can include some more district-specific information, such as where they can find a certain form that they need to meet a requirement, who approves certain items, how documentation should be saved, etc. Are the principals in your district aware of the Title I Part A Documents and Resources webpage, or have you maybe shared links to some of the resources that are available there? Some of the things on the webpage aren't geared towards principals, of course, but I've listed some of our resources that may be of benefit to them on this slide, and so we're just going to run through these quickly. Of course, the Title I handbook goes without saying. It's full of lots of information about the Title I program. You may want to consider highlighting specific sections for principals to focus on, such as the school-wide program section or the parent and family engagement section. We also have our Safeguarding Assets purchased with Title I funds. This document could provide insight to principals on why it's important to have some sort of system and inventory, labeling, some sort of tracking system in place for items that they purchase with their federal funds. And that's not just Title I funds, it's all federal funds. We have our Comprehensive Improvement Planning and Title I Part A webinar. It's a relatively new resource. This webinar and the accompanying PowerPoint highlight how diagnostic tools such as the needs assessment and the CSIP inform the Title I program and how the Title I program should be represented and referenced in those documents. As I mentioned earlier, the CSIP is the school-wide program plan that is required under ESSA, and therefore we should see references to Title I within that document. Title I should be listed as a funding source for some of those activities. The next document is our allowable cost checklist and procedures. This document can help principals understand why the district has created and adopted their own allowability checklist. It can also provide insight into why you may have principals provide specific information or specific documents when they're submitting a purchase request to you. The Title I carryover information document can provide an understanding of the importance of the timely expenditure of funds. As we've mentioned in other webinars, our monitoring checklist can be used as a sort of self-assessment, as well as provide some recommendations on the type of documentation to save to demonstrate compliance. And for our districts who have already opted in or plan to opt in to the Title I Next platform, it could be helpful for principals to see the connection between the requirements that are going to be listed in Title I Next and where they came from, which is the checklist. We have a webinar on Title I documentation, and in addition to providing an overview of the school level monitoring checklist, principals can learn some tips and tricks for ensuring that all of their documentation is effective, detailed, and strong. We have several different parent and family engagement checklists related to policies and compacts. These documents list all of the requirements for the school level policy and the compact, so principals can use these as a reference to ensure that their policy describes how the school will meet each requirement. And finally, we've got all of our monthly newsletters and webinars, and we do keep those posted for 1 year. So now we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at some of the information that principals can gain from these resources. Up first is the newsletter. Over the past year, each month's newsletter has contained at least one article that could have been shared with principals. We had 11 different articles related to parent and family engagement in some way, shape, or form. We also had articles about paraeducator requirements in Title I schools, evaluating school-wide program implementation. We had reminders about not using Title I funds on entertainment costs and social events, as well as an overview of the Title I resources available on our webpage. All of these newsletters are still available on our Documents and Resources webpage, so you may want to consider forwarding articles to principals or even encouraging them to subscribe. You can subscribe directly from the newsletter, or if you want to send me a list of email addresses, I can add them to the subscriber list as well. Now you're going to see a new feature in the next newsletter, which will come out next week, and it's called A Principal's Perspective. And that article is where we are going to feature updates, insights, and resources that are specifically tailored to principals at Title I schools. Now the newsletter may contain other articles that principals will find useful, but the Principal's Perspective article is really written specifically with the principals in mind. For example, the April article is going to focus on funding field trips with Title I funds. Now, we may not have a Principal's Perspective article in every single month's issue, but when we do, that title is going to automatically alert you as the coordinator to pass that information along to the schools. You can also look in the top right-hand corner of each newsletter for an In This Issue summary, and that contains a quick overview of each issue's contents. I also maintain a list of each newsletter and the articles that were featured. So if you're ever having trouble finding an article, you think you read something in a Title I newsletter, but you can't find it, just reach out to me and I'll see if I can find it. Although the target audience for our webinars is district coordinators, many of our webinars contain information that principals should know. For example, today's webinar has information on evaluating their school-wide programs. I went back and looked at the webinar segments that we've had over the last year, and a number of them could be shared with principals. Again, we had a lot of parent and family engagement. We had information on the policy, the compact, the annual meeting, discussing the compact during elementary level conferences, the do's and don'ts of parent and family engagement events, as well as obtaining and utilizing parent feedback. We also looked at monitoring feedback to inform continuous improvement, monitoring program effectiveness, paraeducator requirements, and the importance of timely spending. So you may have noticed a bit of a theme between the newsletter and the webinar topics, and that is parent and family engagement. I've mentioned in previous webinars that parent and family engagement findings are some of the most common findings that we see during monitoring. So we try to provide a lot of technical assistance in that area. You may have also noticed a bit of crossover of topics between newsletters and webinars. That's because we try to provide information through a variety of means just to increase the likelihood that that information is received and understood. So coordinators are welcome to forward webinar links to principals and/or share the recording link once it's available. You could even provide them a timestamp reference so they know exactly what part of the webinar they need to jump to. You can also refer to the agenda slide of each month's PowerPoint. That's a really easy way to see what was covered in that webinar without having to rewatch the entire recording. And I also maintain a separate list of all of our webinars and topics, just like I do for the newsletter. So if there's one that you're having a hard time finding, just reach out and we'll see if we can find it. I skipped a slide. All right, so that wraps up our webinar today, but we're going to check and see if there are any questions. Okay, I saw we had in the chat, in case you didn't see it, will Title I next be mandatory? And that was answered. We don't anticipate making that a mandatory system at this time. And let me check my email really quickly to see if we got any questions there. All right, I don't see any in the email. And be sure to mark your calendar for our upcoming webinar dates. Our next webinar is going to be Thursday, April 25th at 10 a.m. Eastern, as always. I always like to remind you guys at the end that we value your feedback and we want to learn what kind of topics you want to see in webinars and newsletters. So if you have any comments, ideas, and questions, if you want to submit those anonymously, you can do so through our feedback survey. So we've got a link here on the slide. It's also in the email I sent you in the newsletter. And of course, you can also send suggestions directly to me or your Title I consultant. I do want to mention, please don't submit questions about the webinar content through that survey because it is anonymous. Then I don't know who asked that question and who I need to send a response to. Right, and it looks like we haven't had any other questions come in. So I will thank you all for joining us and we'll see you on the April webinar. Have a great day.